morning, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion about the interplay between religion and populism. We have a really great panel discussion set up for us today. Before we begin, I just wanted to introduce myself and our organization for anyone who is joining us for the first time. My name is Courtney Dogger. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community, and we're focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We really try to leverage entrepreneurial, established, and emerging leaders to highlight and drive innovative solutions to challenges that lie in the realm of international affairs. So we do a lot of work besides these discussions, so please do check us out on our website, follow us on social media, and everything else if you can. And just as a quick housekeeping note, we are in full planning mode for our annual Innovators Awards in Global Affairs and Gala. This will take place in New York City on September 28th. We have a really great lineup. We'll be honoring a few people, including retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman with our Ted Sorensen Award, the CEO of Deloitte Global, Puneet Ranjan, with our Global Leadership Award. We have a few soon to be unveiled newer organizations that are taking innovative approaches to tackling challenges that lie in the realm of international affairs. And we'll be doing a keynote conversation with the president of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband. So it's a really exciting evening. It is also critically important to our work. So if you're in New York City, we encourage you to buy tickets. I think Brian will pop the link in the chat. And if you are not in New York City, I do encourage you to support our work with a donation. This is major in terms of keeping this kind of work going. So thank you all for listening to my spiel, and I really do hope to see many of you in New York and appreciate the support online as well. So with that, it is my great pleasure to turn to our two experts. We have two top-notch people on this question today. And first, I'd like to introduce Jocelyn Cesari. She holds the chair of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and at Georgetown University, she is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She is also the author of We, God's People: Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in the World of Nations. This is a newer book from which a lot of what she will say will derive from. So encourage you to check that out for the longer version. We are also very pleased to welcome Kalpana Jain. She is an award-winning journalist and author, and is currently the senior ethics and religion editor at The Conversation US, which is a global news website. And there she writes on Hindu nationalism and social justice issues. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. So, getting to the conversation, I'm going to start with you, Jocelyn, and I'm going to start where I usually like to start, which is to make sure that we're all on the same page. You make a very important distinction between religious nationalism and religious populism. What, in your mind, are the differences, and what are the trends that you have been seeing more recently in the latter, in the populism side of things? And just to tag on to there, are there different kinds of relationships you see developing between the populist leaders and the groups that they are deriving their endorsements from?
Yes, thank you, Courtney. The distinction I make between Christian nationalism and religious populism is quite counterintuitive for the American audience. The term populism is very much used in Europe to refer to movement like white supremacist groups, but in America, the term uses Christian nationalism, and I have some issues with it for two reasons related to the American history itself. Christianity in the political history of America as a more complex and sometimes more positive input than the term Christian nationalism that is used now, which implies that the relationship between Christianity and nationalism is always negative or intolerant or exclusivist. That is not the case in American history. And so there is here some kind of confusion that is misleading, and that is actually leaving out of the discussion a huge group of Americans who identify as Christians and Americans, but do not identify themselves as white supremacists or Trump followers. And the reason also why populism is more relevant is that because in the comparative world, if we compare America with lots of other movements, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America or Eastern Europe, you see two features of populism that are very present in the Trump followers or white supremacists in America. The first one is the identification to a strong leader that trumps all other kinds of institutional allegiance or loyalty to institutions, and we have seen that at play. And second is a sense of victimhood, meaning that the people who identify with this particular strong leader talking for the whole political community have also a sense that they are either marginalized, mistreated, misunderstood in the current political situation. And these two features are not common in any other form of religious nationalism. You have lots of other ways to be religious and nationalist. And these two features, you can associate them with lots of movements that were also considered populist, like fascism, like lots of Stalinism. You know, this is a kind of identification to a strong leader that supersedes any loyalty to other different groups and insists on the fact that we are misunderstood, we are mistreated. And in this case, religion is part of this narrative. And that's, I think, a distinction that if we want to compare America to the broader, political landscape of extremism, of political extremists today, make more sense than Christian nationalism.
Okay, thank you. Turning to you, Kalpana, I'm curious if you have anything to add in particular with the experience in India, and if you could just give us a brief overview of that evolution of religious populism and Hindu nationalism from your perspective, and also how the leaders of national movements have changed over time.
Thank you, Courtney. I think Jocelyn's remarks are really spot on and very interesting because they also, sort of help me think through what's going on in India, and there are certain commonalities in what's happening there. Coming back to my experience, and I talk as a journalist, and based on my reporting, lived experience, I grew up in a city called Meerut and experienced communal flare-ups from time to time. So what I'm trying to say is, what we are observing at this point of time has a long history. And the history really goes back to, what is the Hindu identity? And this notion of who does this land, India, belong to? And, really going back in time, this land that we call India was ruled by Muslims for like 700 years. And then come the British. And then at that time, in the 1920s, a movement starts, call it whether nation building or a Hindu identity movement. But the whole part of that was, it's a political ideology that emerges in the early 20th century. And the Hindu nationalist organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, gets founded in 1925. And their idea is to create a Hindu state. And what they claim is that Hindus alone were the owners of the land, and Muslims were outsiders or invaders. And, this sort of then has a long trajectory. It's around that time, we've seen of late in India, violence around eating beef emerge, but that again has a history because this symbolism because who's a Hindu? That's a very, very diverse and large group. So the symbolism, various symbolisms emerge. A strong one is unite people around cow protection. Now, who can say no to that? And that started in the late 19th century. And it's built up so much that when the Constitution of India is being written, so this is the Constituent Assembly elected to write the Constitution, and they want a prohibition on cow slaughter to be included in the chapter on fundamental rights. And, this is a secular country that is coming up, but that is something that they want written in the constitution. And after much debate, it's decided that it be a directive principle of the state policy, which means the states get to decide what they want to implement and what they don't want to implement. So basically saying that this has a long history. And in the 1980s, and I think it's important for people to understand this history, that in the 1980s, the BJP, that is the ruling party now, had 2 seats when it came to the parliament, the general elections. So since 1980 to now, it has come to power in the way that it has. And there has been a certain process to it. And of course, it's a very complicated process. I will mention a few things that scholars have pointed out that I've observed. And one significant thing that happens around time is the televising of, it's a beautiful epic, the Ramayana, the story of Lord Rama. Comes into Indian homes, there are people actually worshipping Rama in front of their television screens. It's a huge hit. But in the backdrop of all that, there is the issue of Ayodhya as the land of Lord Rama simmering that BJP has been trying to take up for a long time. So the issue was there even before independence. I remember covering this as a young reporter, and it was never really getting picked up in the media. There were no big headlines. No one was really picking it up in a big way. So now this Ramayana serial is telecast. And then there is a Rath Yatra, so a chariot. This is basically a van, but the then president of the BJP, L.K. Advani, he starts a Rath Yatra, taking that van around, trying to build support. Brian, could you show us those images and see how the creation of Rama starts? So this is the Rama that you see as part of the television serial, on television. Now let's see, could you move to the next one? And this is L.K. Advani, posing exactly in the same way as Rama. And now, Modi's won victory in Ayodhya. There's, Ayodhya, actually, I went there about 3 years ago. It was like a town which had nothing in it. We couldn't even find a hotel to stay in. Now it's being built as, this modern city with amenities and really, coming up as a tourism site, as a city of Lord Rama, which has been neglected all these years because no one paid attention to it. So now the third slide, Brian, please. This is Modi. So he's also projecting himself as the lookalike of Rama or as the savior of Rama. So this is a politics being built up. Yeah, you can stop sharing, Brian. Thank you. And I think this sort of history is really important to see how this Hindu identity is being created, how a group is being, sort of coalesced together. And I want to just also add that when Advani started his Rath Yatra, and I remember that very clearly, I actually covered it. I was there when he started it. One of his slogans was, which appealed to a large part of the Hindu population because of various reasons, which group was being privileged, who was feeling left out, this notion of victimhood that Jocelyn was talking about. And the slogan that Advani used was, and I'll say it in Hindi and then translate, Garv se kaho hum Hindu hain. Say with pride that you are a Hindu. It really caught on. So very interesting developments, and today we've come to this. And I can shift if you want me to talk about the narrative, but I don't know if you want me to talk about
Yes, yeah, I did want to just follow up quickly because I think that what you've dug into here a little bit, you've unearthed a little bit about the history and then also the storytelling that's going on. And so I'd love just if you could talk a little bit, because I know you've mentioned in some of your articles, this idea of the narrative. So if you could just quickly just talk a little bit about why you focus on that and why does it matter?
Because I'm from the media and I just see how important parts of this story are being lost and whose voices are being privileged and how. One of the examples I want to offer is of, this It's seen as a militant women's Hindu nationalist organization called Durga Vahini. I went and talked to those women. So, and, emerged with a clear understanding that this is essentially a patriarchal organization, that Hindu organizations are using these women who've been so suppressed by patriarchy, giving them some leadership roles to basically carve the next generation of the idealized Hindu upper caste, middle class woman, and what are the values that they should have. The rest is just frills and nothing else. And it's the same upper caste, a certain kind of Hindu voice that you hear. And what you hear in the Western media is a lot of I live in the US, and when I read those stories, and I feel like someone who doesn't know India, who's never been there, will never understand the context of this or where this is all coming from, because it appears like one big Hindu homogeneous group, which all thinks in the same way. They all identify as Hindu nationalists, whereas the reality is very different. We don't think about lived religion. Lived religion is very different. There are generations and generations of people who lived in this civilization that has been shaped over centuries through various influences. And they're actually embedded rituals. So let's say a Muslim procession has to move through a dense city. There is a Hindu who has to come and do certain rituals before that procession can move. So how, all these rituals have been made part of the culture of living so people can live peacefully, at least most of the time. It's not just shared economic activity, it's the densely populated neighborhoods with the temple and the mosques right next to each other. People can't afford to fight, even if they thought their religious identities were the most important things in their life. And that is oftentimes, or maybe, sometimes not the case, but it is changing. A lot of it is changing. The India that I used to know, how my parents used to go to a Peer Baba, worship there. And that was just normal. There was kind of a religious fluidity in that environment. That is being replaced by a Hindu nationalist version of what a Hindu looks like. One more example to give, just to show how a narrative is built up. So sometime back, there were the butcher shops in the state of Uttar Pradesh were being attacked by people from Hindu nationalist organizations, and the assumption was, well, they're all Muslims and they are being attacked. I think we were losing the bigger story, which is, and how political this story is. So one, there are lower castes involved in these businesses, or whether in the cow business, in the tanning industry, that is just not heard of as much. Two, the bigger story is that beef exports have actually increased under the Modi government. And the people who are involved in the business of whether, the bigger business of exporting beef or slaughterhouses are not Muslims. So just, listening carefully, who is putting that narrative out and why?
Terrific. Thank you for that. Jocelyn, turning back to you, you've done a lot of research for your book, The Islamic Awakening, and more recently with We God's People that we mentioned earlier. And I'd love for you to just switch gears a little bit. And, we've talked about Hinduism, we've talked about what's happening in the US. What are your thoughts on how these questions and conversations relate to Islam, in particular in places like Egypt and Turkey and Iraq, Pakistan and Tunisia, which you've focused on? What are you seeing there?
So I would like to take a step back and be even more comparative than only Muslim countries. What I say in the book is that the international system doesn't exist if there is no nation state. Okay, this sounds obvious, but what I show in the book is that actually the building of the nation state everywhere, and including in the West, has huge impacts on the way that religious traditions try to define themselves vis-a-vis the political power. And to think that there has never been relations between religion and politics is misleading. There was before, but the nation state changed something dramatically. It introduced the idea of equality of membership and sovereignty of people that are two ideas that fly against any vision of any religious tradition. And here I'm very strong. Find me any religious community that is based on equality of membership and sovereignty of people. You can find one or the other, the two together, impossible. And it changed Christianity also in the West, but let's forget this story for now. So what happened is that the religious tradition had to readjust their sense of belonging and sense of sovereignty to adjust to this new framework. And to go back to what was discussed before on India, Hinduism, and you mentioned it, Kalpana, it does exist now, it is relevant, but first and foremost, before even the encounter with the British, it's a multiplicity of local traditions that do not think of themselves vertically with a sort of hierarchy. It's multiple, it's very diffuse, and what makes sense is the local identification and belonging that are plural religiously. You have Hindus and Muslims sharing the same ethnic, linguistic, cultural place, and religion is part of it, but doesn't overcome it. What happened with the nation, and this is true everywhere, the sense of nationality also led to an homogenization with Muslims on one side, Hindus on the other. And this is inherent to the history and ambiguity of nationalism in India. Of course, Gandhi wanted everybody to be part of it, but he was also very Western in the sense that he said, oh, the best way to keep people together is to look at religion. While people locally were looking at themselves as part of different local community, not through religion. This is the Western influence of the nation state everywhere. And so you have now the moment where this interaction becomes more tense, but it has always been tense. Kalpana is absolutely right. If we don't do history, we don't understand that the BJP doesn't come from, the last 20 years. It starts with the discussion of what is a nation, what is an Hindu nation, and an Hindu nation can become an Hinduist nation. It's in there. And so if I may finish on Muslim countries, it's the same thing with Muslim countries with different outcome. Like in the Indian subcontinent, there is no sense of a religious minority that is a Muslim minority. Think of Syria. The Alawi, until the Western encounter, they are not a minority. They are Muslims with a different kind of denomination, and they are persecuted by the Sunni, but they are not a minority. That's the Western vision of this is a minority group similar to the Christians or the Yazidis. No. That's this kind of vision that create the identification between the Sunni belonging, for example, in a lots of Muslim countries that are in majority Sunni, and the national belonging. And what is counterintuitive is that this connection was made by very secular nationalists. Kemal Atatürk, he built Turkey on the idea that we are Turkish, we speak Turkish, and we are Sunni. What about the Alevi, the Christians? We tend to forget Muslim empires were multilinguistic, multicultural, multi-religious. The national identity broke this down. I keep saying, if I were Greek Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, I was part of the Ummah. The nation built an homogeneity that makes me impossible to be part as a citizen of the Turkish nation. And this was done by Kemalists, okay, not by Islamists. And the Islamists build on this connection. They don't have to fight for being a Muslim citizen and being a national. What they fight for is more Islam in the state. There is no Islamic state in the Islamic tradition. You claim for it the moment you have internalized the idea that being a citizen and being a Muslim is the same thing, which in itself is very exclusivist and explains the second rate or second stage of citizenship for people who are Copt or Christians or other kinds of minorities. And again, this is not the outcome of the Islamists. The Islamists are the second generation claiming even more Islam, but they are not creating the situation. And I think we have underestimated this influence of the national belonging over the religious community and their way to deal with membership, equality, and loyalty also to political power. And I stop here.
Thank you. That was an incredibly helpful overview, and especially going back, as you say, that this is a construct that has, and it goes back more than 20 years, 40 years, it goes way back. However, and turning to you, Kalpana, we're in this interesting time period, and I think a lot of this relates back to this idea of narrative, where media has changed dramatically and how we get information has changed dramatically. And there's new forms of social media, new forms of disinformation, of suppression. What are you seeing? What kinds of challenges do you see for global and regional media with the advent of social media and with the circumvention of really traditional outlets?
Oh God, Courtney, you'll have to force me to stop on that. So I think one of the most damaging and long-lasting legacy of the Trump era is giving vocabulary and calling news fake news, disinformation. So people were always, many people, let's say, were unhappy with the media from time to time. I've been a journalist long enough to know that you didn't make friends. You were always in adversarial relationships, but people did not have this kind of a vocabulary, just so quick and, to throw it at you and to completely discredit you. I think that kind of a language has become so much in circulation, picked up by social media, and just, the line between what is truth and what is not has been so blurred. I mean, I never saw this kind of, okay, this is a left-wing media and this is a right-wing media. We worked in organizations that at least tried, they may not have been perfect, but tried to bring a balance on both sides. Now it's a very, very polarized world and globally. To add to that, it's the media ownership, it's going into the hands, and I can speak for India and a bunch of other countries, into the hands of billionaires, into becoming very commercialized, even here in the United States. And which again skews news. I mean, in India at this point of time, there is a hostile takeover bid happening with a major television channel where a billionaire who's a key supporter of Modi wants to take over that channel, which has been doing some great work. And another channel has already been taken over by a billionaire, another key supporter. So that's the way the media is changing. Journalists are under a lot of pressure because journalists are there. They want to do their work, but they need a platform. And social media does not filter out on, there are no editors there. We do need editors, gatekeepers, who will say, well, this is missing, here is, how you need to bring truth. These are the precautions that you need to take before you put anything out. So that is gone. And at the same time, political parties have become extremely smart, and we saw that with Trump, in using the social media. And it's the same with and I won't single out any political party. They're all doing it. In India, both the opposition and the ruling party is doing it. But what's interesting and I'll quote Christopher Jaffrelot, the scholar, on this, who now writes that, there was a time when RSS, the Hindu nationalist organization, wanted to spread its shakhas or branches all around as a way to reach people. And now shakhas, as he says, are less important than social media. So very quickly, these political parties have modernized their way of communication, their way of reach, their way of, really getting around to people. And the media is struggling because, the funding models aren't there. There are just so many challenges at this point of time. And we know that, foreign bureaus have been folded up. And let me add one more thing. I mean, journalists are being killed. My own colleague and friend, Gauri Lankesh, was killed in India. We were together in Times of India. She was killed a couple of years ago. And this is again global. I mean, journalists are going through a lot of threats and a lot of problems in trying to cover anything and put out anything. And the final thing, in my younger days, there would be threats. Maybe, they could have killed me, but I usually treated that as a bullying tactic. I survived. These days, I think it's much harder, the kind of not just subtle pressure, the pressure that comes to you through social media, the trolling, the vicious attacks, especially if you're a woman, and especially if you're writing on difficult and controversial topics. It is very hard to survive those. I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to hear about your friend. That's awful, and you bring up also a really excellent point. I think there's so much focus on, at least from the U.S. perspective, on the idea of media that is free from influence of the state, but the idea of who's paying the bills, I think, is an incredibly important one too. I just want to get a couple more questions in before I turn to the Q&A box, because there's some really great questions coming in. And again, if you're listening and want to put questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. Jocelyn, I just wanted to return to what you set the stage with in terms of talking about the US. And if you wouldn't mind contrasting that with Europe and just talking about why we see such a difference in religious populism and the way that leaders harness religious populism between the US and Europe.
Yeah, in Europe now you have lots of populist movement who define themselves as Christians against Islam. So that's more, to put it differently, sort of civilizational position. Most of these people do not want a Christian France or Christian Germany. What they are saying is oppositional. We are Christian by history, by legacy, and we don't want more Islam in Europe. And if you look at the demographic, lots of them are very, very secular. I mean, most of them are very secular. So they would be appalled by the agenda of the Christian nationalists in America around question of abortion, contraception. They are far from that. Actually, they even don't understand it. So that's a big difference right there in the way that religion plays a role in both states. Interestingly, I think that the American way of being religiously populist looks very much closer to the Islamic one. The Islamic are doing the same kind of connection. They are saying, okay, we are Muslim and Tunisian, or Muslim and Egyptian, but we want more of Islam in the legislation, in the way we all interact. So that's a kind of interesting comparison that I always make, because nobody may remember, but when Erdogan came to power and tried to install and establish more morality in political life, his example was America. He never said we are Islamist. He said we are conservative. We are morally conservative, like America is. And he was referring exactly to the same kind of agenda on gender. I mean, women are the site of contestation everywhere. And it's also true in India, by the way. The women are the site of contestation, the body of women, for this kind of, I would say, religious populism, where you try to recreate a morality. And the first way to do that is to control women's body, women's sexuality, and gender relations. So that would be the connection here. America is closest to Muslim country than it is to Europe on this particular topic.
And the interesting thing there too, and I've done research in Turkey, and actually Network 2020's first research program was in Turkey, and this was, you know, pre-EU accession negotiations, before the EU came to a decision. And it's so interesting because what we heard at the time is, you know, how much, you know, that from leaders in Turkey, that the EU was defining itself as a Christian club, and that they needed to figure that out. And the irony there is that in the defining in opposition to, you know, there are different trends going on, because they just didn't want, seem to want a large Muslim nation.
Yeah, this was a strategic mistake of the EU to reject the Turkish application. That has changed the balance of power. It has reinforced this identity politic of Erdogan. This was really a strategic mistake, you know.
Good for another webinar. We can dig into that. You know, just really quickly, I'm going to start weaving in questions from the chat box, but I'll turn to you, Kalpana, because I want to make sure I get to the Q&A box. We have someone who's asking, what do you suggest could be some religiously inspired policies that highlight this growing religious populism and in turn intolerance? So if you know, could you give some examples of some of these like policies that you're seeing?
I think I need to understand the question better. So is this related to India? What are the policies?
I think probably in particular, and then maybe Jocelyn, if you might have some comments from a wider range. So you know, how do you see that taking place in India?
Oh, so I'll mention one which is called love jihad, and the idea behind. So what love jihad means is that for Hindu nationalists, what it means is that Muslims are waging jihad. And this is a love jihad. So what they're doing is that they would be marrying Hindu girls and then converting them. And that's a way of, you know, Islamization. There is a law that's come, which is called, I think, a love jihad law. It's so far in one state, Uttar Pradesh, has implemented it, and others are working on it, where a couple that wants to go in for an interfaith marriage has to first go and seek permission, has to, you know, put in an application, go seek permission from the government. So, and maybe others will follow suit. So that's the one big example that I can think of right now. But
yeah, and so to clarify, that's something that was not in place before, in terms of like people could have interfaith marriages and it wasn't an issue.
Absolutely, never was that an issue. And I mean, there have been interfaith marriages all this while, and the whole language of the country was very different at this point of time. I mean, if you have an interfaith marriage, you would be worried about, you know, whether Hindu nationalists are going to come in or not.
That's interesting. Jocelyn, any policies that you're seeing on a global level that are making their way into government where that wasn't the case before?
Definitively, I would say all gendered policies today have some kind of moral connotation related to this populist agenda. That's also the case, for example, in Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church has tried strongly to revisit the right to abortion, and also to reinstall a sort of more moral type of sexual relation, no sex before marriage, and all these kind of things. I have to say that the Russians are resisting because they come out of, you know, half a century of communism. So they would say very happily that they are Orthodox and Russian, a little like the European are saying we are European and Christian, but they are not very enthusiastic on this kind of agenda, although it doesn't prevent the church to push it. And you see also the discourse on restricting the right of sexual minorities. It's the same kind of logic here. So what we are saying is that, witnessing is that the religious populism is really targeting women and all kinds of sexual groups, which is true everywhere, from homosexual to transgender, everywhere. And this transcends Christian, Islam, Hinduism kind of divide here, right there.
This next question, I'll stay with you, Jocelyn, and I'm going to try to put my own spin on it, and also based on what you've spoken about before. So the questioner says, for Jocelyn, today it seems that the distinction between political and religious in Western as well as Eastern countries is blurring. Why do you believe, what are some of the reasons that you believe that this evolution has happened? And so what I want to just append to that is, I know you talked about the idea of the nation state before as a construct and that identity as influencing that. Are there other factors? And then related to that, because it seems like some of this might be a pushback against, dare I say, Western liberal values, is there, do you see that as a factor as well?
So we live on the assumption that religion and politics have nothing to do with the other. While historically, even in the so-called cradle of secular culture in Europe and to a certain extent America, that has not been true historically. So you have always intermingling and interaction between the two. What we are witnessing more and more is that the modernization process all over the world has put an emphasis on the individual, with the goal to limit religion to my person. If you ask people what is religion, they're going to tell you it's my belief. But religion is more than that. Religion, as I tried to mention before, it's a community. There is no religion if you don't have a community. No messenger comes from one person or for the benefit of one person added to another. And so what the political modernity has done is to erode the capacity of religion to say things for the common good. And for a while it worked, the state, because again, it's based on the idea everybody's equal, everybody's getting the same treatment. It was quite appealing, including among religious communities. We are now at a stage where the state is failing, and not only in the so-called global South, in the North as well. The way that the American state has handled the pandemic is appalling. It's like it's a failed state. So how can you present yourself as a guarantee of security and equality for all citizens when you cannot do this anymore? That's where religious communities are coming to the fore and saying, listen, we have moral values that can challenge this inhuman, unequal kind of treatment. And it's appealing to people. Young people, especially, we are witnessing everywhere a rise of religiosity. We can discuss what this means, but it means that religious community, religious tradition are providing moral alternative to the secular one that have failed. And that's where what we used to think, oh, religion is my little private space. This is going away everywhere. In America, we just talked about it. It's also true in Europe. It has never really reflected the reality of religion elsewhere. I always say to my student, and Kalpana can stop me, India is secular. Look at India. It doesn't separate religion and politics, which is supposedly institutionally what secular is. There is no privatization of religion. It's everywhere. And there is no decline of personal religiosity. So India is secular indeed, but not in the way we have thought of secular. And that's what I keep saying, and that's what I try to say in the book. It is about time we shift our categories and stop thinking of religion as something threatening. Of course, there are threats, we just talk about it, but there are also pockets of resources that we are not taking into account in the way we could refound our social contract, in which religious citizens could feel more comfortable.
That's actually, I was going to turn to Kalpana, but I think I actually would like to, because this gets to an interesting part about the solutions, right? And sort of we're in this very interesting space. What would you suggest? I mean, it sounds like, what, if you could just expand on what you just said about finding these pockets and renegotiating, sort of that relationship. How would you recommend best doing that?
Are you talking to me or Kalpana?
Yes, yeah. I'm talking to you. I'd love for you to expand on this idea that you just put forward for your book.
How do we do that? We do that by allowing a greater visibility of religious voices of all kinds in the public space. That's the first thing. Instead of focusing only on for example, we are in America, so why we just give or pay attention, and this goes to journalists too. I have had this conversation with some of colleagues in the news domain. We always focus on the evangelical with the intolerant agenda. There are tons of evangelical and believers who are uncomfortable with this agenda. Do we give them a voice? I know there is a whole network building saying, I am a Christian, I am an American patriot, I don't want to be associated with this intolerant agenda. Who are they? So there is some necessity here to broaden up the discussion, to multiply the different positions among religious groups on this question of politics. And we'll be surprised how more diverse the landscape is, one. And second is also to be clear that politics, and this also means a commitment on the part of secular politicians, not only on the religious actors, they don't include a specific religious agenda into the mainstream politics. That was one of the most damaging outcome of the Trump administration. He included more of the evangelical prescription on sexual minorities, on women's body, than more pious president like Bush. Bush was a pious president. He didn't go as far as Trump. So there is something in there about, okay, religious groups should not take on the political agenda, but we need a recommitment of the political class not to take advantage of one particular agenda to promote their own legitimacy. And I think it looks like, I'm describing an ideal world, but there was a time where this was possible, when religion was shared across the partisan line. What is worrisome to me is that now religion is only seen on one side, the Republican side, which is worrisome, because again, you have lots of religious minorities on the other side, but you don't speak up about that. We don't mention them. And that's the two things: more voices of religious groups in their diversity, and overcome the partisan divide on religion. And
yeah, and Jimmy Carter was another one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, this is gone. I don't know. That's a damage to democracy right there.
Kalpana, as a journalist, do you want to react to that in terms of how you see that landscape and the idea of bringing in more of a multitude of voices, of highlighting that diversity that you also referenced in India? How do you see that?
So, I mean, a bunch of things, I lived if we look at the world in a binary way, moved from east to the west, I feel like I have a better view of the world now. So there is generally, especially in all kinds of, people who think they're liberal, whether it's the East, the West, just the denial of the existence of religion until it's, so political. And then they want to treat it as political and as though it doesn't exist in the day-to-day life. And when you start to look at the US, it's everywhere, but people don't see it. It's on the dollar bill, in God we trust. It's everywhere. So, and I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I think it's really understanding how deeply we relate to religion in whatever way. If people are moving away from organizational religion, they are still redefining religion for themselves. And yes, we need those diversity of voices. We need to see more of that. And I know Jocelyn mentioned about journalists, and I will say journalists have a really hard time getting closer to religion or what they perceive as religion. It's something like not to be touched, not to be going near. There is a real discomfort with it. I don't know why. It's maybe part of what it comes from, some notion of if you're progressive, then you're not religious, or religion means X, Y, and Z. So I think some ways in which we sort of retrain ourselves to think about religion, think about, what we are missing in that moral language, what it can bring to us. And just from my perspective as a journalist, I know that a lot of it we are just losing. We are losing religion journalists. We are losing that reporting. We are losing the experts in the media who could write about it, because newspapers are bleeding. The media is bleeding. There are just layoffs every day. Just 2 days ago, National Geographic laid off many of its senior editors. It's just all over. So how do you save this institution that we've called the fourth estate, that is so valuable and more valuable now? How do you save the local newsrooms? How do you save the foreign bureaus that had expertise in a culture, in a language, could go and report? So now you get this parachute reporting, just someone, going in, parachuting in, and coming up with something that might do more harm, because then a culture that reads it says, well, this is the way people write about us. And it leads to more anger, and it leads to more alienation, and it leads to more feeling of victimhood.
Yes, yeah. I think it's something like it went in the US, the number of minutes of reporting with an international, someone on the ground went from like 1,600 minutes a year in 1988 to something like 500 in like 2016 or something like that. I mean, it's just precipitous, the drop. Kind of a nuts and bolts question for you, Kalpana. 2 parts. One questioner asks, is India moving from a secular state with a Hindu majority to a religious Hinduist state that only tolerates certain minorities under Modi? And with that, how popular is Modi, and is he likely to get reelected?
Okay, I'll answer the second one first. Modi is popular. The fact is that he gets majority vote. And that, there's something to be said about that. It's populism. It's a lot of factors that goes into it. I've gone and talked to Muslim voters. I don't know, how far they're telling me the truth. It's often not easy to know, but they like him. They like him for the development work he's done. He's, the Congress couldn't do about the Uniform Civil Code, and Muslim women were wanting, this triple talaq that existed in India to end. And so he had a lot of Muslim women on his side, until, of course, there's a more recent thing that happened where Bilkis Banu's, the Gujarat riot, the accused were released. So let's see how it plays up to the elections. But Modi also has it in him to change the conversation when it's closer to the election. So we'll see. He's a very, very strategic player. So he might. And the fact that the opposition is pretty much non-existent. It's so weak at this point of time. The Congress party that people have relied on as the main party or the main opposition party, but there might be new regional configurations. We've had the Dalit parties, the Muslim parties. So there might be, it always happens. India throws up surprises. So having said that, I'll also, just want to be a little cautious that I don't speak, just don't overstate. We'll see about that. Whether India is moving towards being a Hindu state, I don't know. I would say I'm worried. There are a lot of people who are worried. And because, as Jocelyn said earlier, and I really like that you can be a Hindu, but you're not a Hindu nationalist. And people are feeling harassed. A lot of people are feeling like they have to behave in a certain way, even if they are Hindus. So, really change the way they talk, they behave, and how they are outside. And there have been some murmurs of constitutional change. Will that happen? Hard to say, but Modi has majority. And Modi seems to have a lot of power at this point of time. And, there is Hindu nationalists are active. And they are taking the country to where they wanted to take it to for a very long time. So that question is up in the air, but it is worrying. And therefore I say, and I went around, let me just quickly add this. I went around Varanasi, which is the political constituency of Modi. It is often written about in the West as a Hindu city, but it is more than that. It's a city of the Jains, it's the Buddha's city where he attained enlightenment, and there are 30% Muslims there. So it's a very interesting city. And I went around throughout that city talking to people. And the culture of that city, it's still embedded in those times where people learned how to live together with this kind of diversity. So whatever India might be, if we can hold on to these values, this culture, this shaping of that land that has happened over centuries, whatever they might call it, it would still retain that culture. And I just hope we don't lose it. And that's why I say we need to tell more stories about that, because otherwise we will lose it. Modi is rewriting the whole history of what the Muslims did, what the Mughals did. Everything is being rewritten, and we can't afford to let that go.
Great, thank you. In the few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to just turn to each of you in turn and just, we've touched a little bit on, I don't want to use the word solutions because I feel like that's, perhaps a little too simplistic. But what is it that you would most like to see to, let's say, right the balance? And I think you've each, perhaps touched on this in turn. So that's sort of on the positive side, because I think that you have touched on this. And what are you most concerned about, whether it's a region or a trend or something of the sort? And, maybe start with the bad and then go to the good. So Jocelyn, I'd love to just start with you. What are you looking at when you're looking at down the road, both in terms of this is worrisome and, this is where I could see a course correction happening?
So what is worrisome everywhere is the lineup of religious identity with the national one. And this leads indeed to what we have been discussing, the risk of exclusion, of gendered politics, and a threat on democracy everywhere, east to west, north and south. What I'm also watching is that the pandemic has opened a window of opportunity for religion to overcome this national trap, I would say. People are more aware than ever of the universal needs of individuals beyond nationality and citizenship. And interestingly, when religion overcomes the denomination and the national agenda, they are the ones that provide resources and responses to people. So what I'm seeing that I have not seen before is at the level of international organization, a greater attention paid to religious groups that do not look like they are either Catholic or Muslims or Hindu, but that talk about the moral needs, the human security, the dignity. The dignity is a term that secular international organizations do not use at all or don't know how to use. But that's a term that makes sense in the moral vision of a lot of religious traditions, the moment they stop looking at their own flock, so to speak, and that they have this more universal role, what we call global governance. And there is this window right there, where on question of pandemic, on war or global warming, on refugee crisis, everything with a humanitarian dimension. And unfortunately, most of our international crises have this dimension. There is a niche now for a religious voice. One, I don't want to say that the Pope is doing that, but that's a kind of position that is now interesting for people who are not even Catholic across traditions, because they say this is what we should do to be relevant internationally. But there is a long way to go. What is interesting is young people, women across tradition are interested in this perspective. But the more you have, invested in your national groups, the harder it is to do that. But the cleavage, the tension within each religious tradition is there. Do I go national? Do I go global? And we don't know yet where the chips are going to fall. But that's what I'm trying to observe right now. Yeah.
Great, a great place to end with you. And Kalpana, what would you like to add?
I mean, my big thing is information, and that is really important for democracy. And how do we safeguard those, vehicles of information in this very new world with a new generation coming up, making up its mind? So, I mean, it's also what we are choosing, the stories that we are choosing to tell, even, with the limited resources we have. There is a lot, as Jocelyn says, there are all these groups that exist. There is a lot of resistance movements happening. There are new religious leaderships that are coming up. It's the stories that we are choosing to focus on. That's also very important. And really understanding which way are the young people going? We are assuming that everyone's thinking in the same way, but maybe the young people do not want this kind of world. So, as I said, listening really hard and trying to see, what information are we not providing, and then ending up creating a world which the powers that be, or who control power, in any case, want us to see created.
Wonderful, a very good place to end. Thank you both. This was a fascinating discussion. I think there's so much ground to cover, and I really appreciate your taking the time and the work that you do. Thank you to everyone who listened and posed questions. Our next event is next week, and it's How Does China Envision the World Order? And originally it was going to be China and Russia, although we weren't able to get the Russia component. But all of this is going to be very interesting, given that Putin and Xi should be meeting next week. So please do join us Tuesday, September 14th. And again, please join us for our Innovators Awards and Global Affairs. If you're not in New York, please donate. This helps keep all of this work going. When it comes to the information space, I think that the work we do is critical, and I would really value any donation would be wonderful. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Courtney and Brian, and thank you, Jocelyn. Great to be here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.